everyone. My name is Gaston Alonso, and I am the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College. I am very, very excited to welcome you to today's event, a celebration of the publication of Matatu work, Gender, Labor, and Mobility in Nairobi, by Brooklyn College anthropology professor Meghan Ference. Now, for this event, we invited Tatiana Thieme to be in conversation with Professor Ference, and she will be sharing from her book titled Hustle Urbanism, Making Life Work in Nairobi, which comes out in just 3 days. So go get them both. And please extend a round of virtual applause to both of them. Now, this is the 7th part. This is part of a 7-part series that the Wolf Institute is hosting this semester to celebrate recent books by Brooklyn College faculty. And I want to invite you to join us for other events in the series later on next month in April. We will put the link to the schedule for that series in the chat. I also want to invite you to join us for the first week of April for HES Week 2025, a series of events organized to honor the work of this year's Brooklyn College's HES Scholar in Residence, Melissa Mary, professor at NYU School of Law, co-host of Strict Scrutiny podcast, and a legal analyst at MSNBC. 26 speakers, 7 public events, 4 days. Urgent conversations with leading legal experts on abortion and democracy, history and the courts, the future of individual rights, the role of the courts in our democracy, podcasting, and of course, our collective future. We are very excited for these events, and we hope that you will join us. We'll put the link to that week's program also in the chat. And lastly, please follow the Wolf Institute on Instagram to learn more about upcoming programming. And the link to that will also be in the chat. And with that, let me introduce today's speakers. Meghan Ference is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Brooklyn College at the City University of New York. Her research interests explore the changing nature of work in urban Africa and the social impacts of urban infrastructure. Her first book, Matatu Work, Gender, Labor, and Mobility in Nairobi, which we celebrate tonight, focuses on how transportation technology has impacted the labor practices in Nairobi, Kenya, and explores the working conditions of the men and the women in Nairobi's popular transportation sector. It is based on 2 decades of ethnographic fieldwork with transport workers in Kenya. Her upcoming research project explores the potential for Kenyan women to impact climate change initiatives in the transport sector. Now, Tatiana Thieme is an urban ethnographer and associate professor of geography based at the University College in London. Tatiana draws together her training in dance, anthropology, and geography from Cornell University, the London School of Economics, and the University of Cambridge to study the social, economic, ecological, and cultural lives of young people who are navigating precarious urban environments. Tatiana's primary field site is Nairobi, Kenya, where she has been conducting ongoing research in popular neighborhoods since 2009. Her secondary field sites are Paris and Berlin, where she has worked with grassroots migrant solidarities since 2017, and London, where she has studied the porosity of carceral spaces. She has published in various journals, and her first monograph, as I mentioned, titled Hustle Urbanism, Making Life Work in Nairobi, is coming out in 3 days with the University of Minnesota Press. And with that, I will turn the microphone over to them.
Thank you so much, Gaston. So I want to thank Gaston and Kiana and the Wolf Institute for organizing this event. And I want to say thank you for all the fantastic events that you hold throughout the year. The Wolf Institute is truly one of the best aspects of Brooklyn College academic life.
Thank you.
Really amazing. So thank you so much. And I want to welcome everyone and thank all of you for coming. I'm happy to see some of my former and current students from Urban Anthro and Economic Anthro here, and some of my colleagues and friends. So I'm excited to share this time with you. And when Gaston asked me if I want to do an event. He said, you can do it in person or in Zoom. And anybody who knows me knows I hate Zoom. But I chose Zoom because it allows for me to talk with Tatiana. And so I am so excited to have Tatiana Thieme here. She is living and working in the UK. She's an amazing scholar, brilliant friend, and her book, as Gaston said, is coming out in just a few days. So I'm just glad we can have this time together. So I just want to welcome and thank you, Tatiana, for being here and staying up late and volunteering your time to be with us. So instead of me giving a talk or kind of reading extensively from the book, Tatiana and I are just going to kind of have a bit of a back and forth, somewhat informal conversation about the book and our books and the concepts we feel are important to understanding Nairobi and urban ethnography, and talk a little bit about friendship and collaboration. And we look forward to answering your questions. So before I turn it over to her for some introductory remarks, I just want to say that we've known each other for 15 years, over 15 years. We met in Nairobi because I sat next to her during a lecture at the British Institute, and I thought, as does today, that she had cool earrings. I was like, oh, she's so like cool. And so then she stood up and asked this like a sophisticated, like amazing question. And when she sat down, I was just like, I need to know you. And we've basically been friends since that day. She is still thoughtful and sophisticated, and her friendship has been an invaluable part of my life and academic journey. And she's made me a better scholar and researcher and writer. And so with that, I want to hand it over to her to kind of introduce herself and share some opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Meghan, for that beautiful intro. And Gaston, thank you so much for inviting me, and Kiana for all the various labors involved in organizing this in the Wolf Institute. I'm really delighted to be with you all and to stay up on this Thursday evening and join you all in celebrating my very dear friend Meghan Ference's monograph, Matatu Work, Gender, Labor, and Mobility in Nairobi. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge this beautiful cover as well. So I'm really delighted to celebrate this book. I want to start by really congratulating Meghan for the publication of this beautiful work for various reasons. And if you would bear with me, I sort of wanted to start by sharing some of my brief reflections on the book and the important intervention that it's making. So from the first page, where we learn about the dark humor laden in Matatu vernacular expressions to evoke the risks of Matatu work and movements, you will eat a tomato, to the last pages that propositionally anticipate the need to include Matatu workers and their street knowledge in any future urban transportation plans and policy. This book takes us on a ride to demonstrate that these minibuses are so much more than mere vehicles helping people get from A to B. Some of these vehicles, as Meghan shows us, are moving billboards and graffiti-laden public works of art and social commentary. They adapt to, shape, and subvert the rhythms of urban traffic. They bounce and jolt. They have a unique loud horn that, to anybody who knows Nairobi, sort of dominates the sonic infrastructures of the urban streets. They are public modes of transport, yes, but they have also been and continue to be, as Meghan writes, micro-publics, and in many ways, intimate spaces where various forms of political life play out, from anti-colonial resistance in the 1950s to contemporary feminist affirmations. They have at different times defied hegemonic forms of modernity, such as the digitization of cash-based economies that had very specific logics for remaining so until the pandemic. And at other times, matatus have innovatively helped shape the evolving cartography of the city, as Meghan's kind of archival and historical reflections and work illustrate in the book. So the characters of these Matatu, their sound and the aesthetic makes people mad and laugh in equal measure, those who are Nairobian commuters of these vehicles. And if you have been to Nairobi and ride Matatu, no doubt you may have seen stickers pasted in front of your seat with sayings like, if the music is too loud, then you are too old. So thanks to my friendship with Meg, as she said, that is now 15 years young, listening to her stories during our conversations when we first met back in 2010, reading her work over the years, collaborating on a special issue for the journal Africa between 2017 and 2021. Yes, journal special issues can take that long, from the first steps of a workshop to the end. And having the privilege of reading drafts of her chapters of this book between 2023 and 2024, I see Nairobi differently through Meghan's writing and through her eyes. Matatu were always my mode of transport in Nairobi, but Meghan's work opens up our sensibilities to their importance for how to, as Ference, author of Afrotopia, writes, read, not just write along, the cityscape. So Ference talks about the multiple ways in which we might read the cityscape. Meghan writes that Matatu minibuses are, and this is a quote, the rhythm of life moving through the city. This is from the intro paragraph of the first chapter. Her book shows us that they are also vital public, political, and cultural characters, as well as social and sonic infrastructures. And it is indeed this that makes up Matatu work. So in other words, this writing, this book, expands how we might think about the urban economy, urban mobility, and urban infrastructures in its multiple senses. And therefore, her book, this ethnography, makes an important intervention at the nexus of several disciplines: African studies, economic anthropology, and urban geography. Importantly, and I'm so glad there's so many students here tonight, the book is also written not just in a beautiful, sophisticated, and eloquent way. It is evocative and accessible in style, in a way that speaks to what ethnography can do at its best, both as method and written form. It will make an important intervention in the scholarship, and it can also, it is, I'm sure, already going to be read by undergraduate students, like many of you all. Reading it and being able to not just admire the scholarship and the writing in its own right, but to also make their own connections between these Nairobi stories and perhaps your own New York stories. How could we read this book and think about the social and cultural history of the New York subway system, for example, or think with Matatu work to consider how women carve out spaces for themselves in various male-dominated economic spheres, from Moscow to Medellin. And ethnography is about a particular place and time, and a particular set of relationships between an ethnographer and a number of interlocutors. But it is also inherently comparative in its register and in how it expands our imagination. It invites us to make connections with other places and other people. It helps us better read our own cityscapes, perhaps, and what's going on with labor regimes in the transport gig economies of other cities across other parts of the African continent and beyond as well. I think this book will interest, for example, practitioners and city mayors beyond Nairobi who care about urban transport policy and how to think about taking seriously existing transport cultures and infrastructures when they seek to reimagine transportation futures. So what may be framed as smart city imaginaries will be profoundly not so smart if they leave out the indigenous economies of transport that shape so much more than just mobility, as Meghan documents and archives and catalogs in this book. So importantly, the book does all this work, but it also dispels some of the stigma and calls out the mythologizing and pathologizing narratives that surround Matatu and Matatu work and workers. It does not shy away from emphasizing various forms of restriction and policing and harassment that Matatu workers endure, but it also explores the cultural logics of work and the ways in which Matatu work can deepen certain vulnerabilities and at the same time reveal profound solidarities and forms of care. So as Gaston said, the timing of this conversation is meaningful in multiple ways. I recently got my copy of Meghan's book and have had the pleasure of rereading various passages, which was so, a wonderful process when you've had the luxury of being able to read another scholar and friend's draft material, work in progress, deliberating over certain
autocratic
passages.
agendas of supremacy.
Oops, sorry. And at the same time, to then turn.
Oh, wait.
Oh, apologies.
We're back.
So, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So this mode of going from being able to read someone's work in progress and draft to then reading the book in its 3D form is a very special process. And at the same time, just a week ago, I got my own copy of my book in its 3D form. So I now hold these two books together and set them in conversation. And it is a very special process to think about this conversation that echoes the many years of friendship, intellectual thinking together, mutual support, and a shared love for Nairobi, and our friends and interlocutors, and so much about the city. So we were together in the field, as Meghan said, met in 2010. I was thinking about this today. We've been back together since in 2017 and then 2023, which is such a luxury when you live in different parts of the world, different life stages, and career trajectories, etc., and you find ways to then coincide once again in your primary field site, even for a small period of time. It's a very precious thing. And then we were at a conference together in 2019, and have obviously managed our digital communications in various ways in order to maintain these wonderful kind of conversations and connections. What I think has animated both my and Meghan's ethnographic work for some time now, and perhaps how our work speaks back to what's going on in Nairobi and perhaps what's going on elsewhere too, is the following. What does it mean to think about people's relationship to work and its many spheres of practice, place, and potency in a world where the legacies and continuities of coloniality, racial capitalism, banishment, and environmental extraction have come to normalize a state of insecurity, uncertainty, and breakdown? In this reality, who and where do we look to better understand how we might not only cope in these times, but also learn with the popular intellectuals, the popular experts, the popular warriors who have been persistently marginalized and stigmatized for not adhering to mainstream hegemonic norms, but whose way of navigating the city, these concentrated spaces of both opportunity and harm, merit our curiosity, concern, attention, solidarity, and respect. And once we find places for deep noticing and engagement and meet people who become our interlocutors, and if we're lucky, friends, how do we begin to write about what we learn, hear, see, feel, and especially how do we do so while also always recognizing that there are so many things we can never really know? I think one of the ways in which my and Meg's book are in conversation is as follows. We both have tried to show how spaces, people, and practices that may be literally and metaphorically situated at the urban peripheries, edges, margins, and interstices are in many ways not just entangled with the rest of the city, but they often make and remake the city. So I'd like to just turn for just a moment to say a word about my book, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So my book is titled Hustle, Urbanism, Making Life Work in Nairobi. And the way I'd like to start by introducing this book is to sort of ask everyone to think about what connects Malcolm X's autobiography published in 1965, Uber's advert in 2016, Kenya's current president, William Ruto, youth living in underserved neighborhoods in Nairobi, and several of my university students in London, and many of you, I'm sure, as well, who have not only their studies to worry about, but perhaps up to 3 part-time jobs. All of these individuals speak of hustle. Now, as a term, Hustle may at first seem too colloquial and even banal to merit much scholarly attention. But it is a concept that has traveled across time and space, defying a singular definition. It is increasingly familiar in everyday contemporary parlance throughout the globe, as a growing number of people across diverse contexts refer to their hustle or their side hustle. Hashtag my side hustle, etc. Get your hustle on, as the Uber advert imperative asked in 2016. This is especially the case since the 2000s amongst millennials, a generation of young people who have grown up facing overlapping crises, including volatile employment prospects, and for whom the rise of the internet and associated digitally mediated platforms have facilitated collective discourses of outrage. The confluence of these factors has shaped experiences and descriptions of work that are simultaneously insecure and often temporary, but they're also affirmative in their dynamic and sometimes innovative dimensions. So the form that hustling takes is varied, and importantly, it is not just about labor. It can be about political maneuvers. It can be about ways of getting things done in a pinch. La brega, Gaston, right? So anybody who loves NPR and the La Brega podcast will remember the amazing ways in which La Brega, this vernacular spoken by in Puerto Rico, and as I understand it, Puerto Riqueños in New York, refer to this idea of la brega as a verb, as a disposition, as a kind of way of describing modes of getting around a problem that cannot quite be fixed, but finding creative ways around it. And there are different, all kinds of different languages and ways of describing cognate terms. But for the sake of this moment and this book, I focus on the Anglophone term hustle and the social history of hustle and how it is resonant in Nairobi, but also reflective of elsewhere. And so if it is about this getting things done in a pinch, a shared struggle, a form of storytelling, a claim to belonging, it can also reflect a kind of detachment from hegemonic and normative expectations. The stories that emerge emphasize a kind of paradoxical subjectivity and narratives of people who do not only make who not only might face overlapping injustices, colonial, neoliberal regimes in cities of the majority world, racialized bordering, policing practices, austerity measures, but who also navigate and innovate through and despite these. So my book tries to argue that hustle is in need of greater attention and perhaps greater theorization. And studying hustle urbanism does three things. First, it opens up a series of timely questions regarding shifting cultures of work outside formal employment in vulnerable and volatile economies in a post-wage and post-pandemic world. Secondly, it helps describe and analyze how precarious environments are navigated at a time when hustling is a situated but increasingly globally resonant expression of struggle, resistance, and ingenuity amongst groups that are relationally made to feel marginalized. And thirdly, it invites a critical engagement with discourses and practices that have elevated, and in some case appropriated, a concept that has been around for a long while, but has recently traversed life worlds across income classes, commercial, and even political spheres. So while hustling is neither new nor mine to define because it is so profoundly subjective and grounded in lived experience, hustle urbanism, in all its complexity, contradictions, and creativity, merits more serious consideration and conceptualization and contextualization. So I'll stop there, but that's basically, that was the premise of trying to write the book, and each chapter looks at a different aspect of hustle urbanism, starting with some of my longtime interlocutors in one of the oldest and largest popular neighborhoods in Nairobi, but also trying to make the case that it is, again, more than labor, and that there are these kind of cultural and political articulations of hustle, as well as a long history, social history of hustle that also merits acknowledgement and taking seriously. So thank you. Meg, I have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
To Seg. So my question to you is, I've sort of explained briefly what I find wonderful about your book, but can you tell us what drew you to Matatus in the first instance?
Well, thank you so much for your comments. And as everyone can see now, why I was like, I'm getting to know this woman after she asked her question in Nairobi so long ago. But I went to Nairobi. I went to Kenya for the first time in 2003 with a study abroad group. And I saw these vehicles on the road. And I mean, it's important to remember that in Nairobi, there are no real formal transport options. So there are only Matatu, and they are often elaborately decorated. There's constantly like Obama Matatu, there's a Burberry Matatu, there's the night nurse reggae song Matatu, there's every type of Matatu you can imagine. There's the Beyonce Matatu. And I was basically in a car with someone and their car broke down and we had to jump in a Matatu. And I was like, what is this? And we got in, it was black lights flashing, music, people standing shoulder to shoulder. My friend just basically pushed me into the vehicle. And I was like, I lost him in the bus. I like couldn't find him anymore. I felt like I was in a club. It could have been an hour, it could have been 10 minutes. All of a sudden I feel it like my shoulder, somebody's tapping, and it's time to get off. I see my friend, we jump out. It's like coming out of a movie theater in the daylight. I was like, what is happening? And I was like, that is how everyone travels to and from work. Okay. Like this is not like a bus I'm used to. And so that stuck with me. And then when I went back, like the next year, I went for another study abroad that was, a more, just a longer term study abroad on, culture and language. And it was right at the time when there was heavy regulations of Matatu. And everyone wanted to talk about Matatu. Everyone was complaining. I mean, I don't want to say that they were, talking high. They were just talking about it, and it was on everyone's tongue. It was 2004. And that's what I realized. This is actually really important in a lot of ways. So it's important to say that they are ubiquitous. There's over 40,000 Matatus in Nairobi. Or in Kenya, and 15,000 in Nairobi alone. They are, things I learned, they're privately owned, but publicly operated. So each Matatu has their own, and especially in 2004, had their own style and their own way of doing things. They're the largest employer of youth in the country. So, and youth is a kind of big category in Kenya. It's not just like people under 18, but it's just kind of generally young people were, working on these things. And then it was mostly male dominated, and they were just a key part of everyday life. So not only was it my first experience of them intriguing, but then going back as an ethnographer, I mean, I wanted to think about other things. I was actually working with Wangari Maathai at the time, and nobody wanted to talk about trees. They wanted to talk about Matatu. And so as a good ethnographer, I just talked about what they wanted to talk about. And then I went back to Rutgers. I was an undergrad, so I went back to classes with this, kind of crazy idea, or just crazy set of experiences. And my advisor, mentor, professor at the time, who's actually here, Angelique Hagerud, was like, you should do a Fulbright. I was like, what is that? I don't know what that is. And so worked very hard with me. And I thought, and she said, is there anything you think you could do that's interesting, anything? And I said, maybe Matatu, I don't know. We did it, and I ended up getting a Fulbright, which frankly, I felt like I had no business getting. But that was the beginning of this project that has now, in 2024, just come to fruition. So it was a kind of a long answer to say that, it was kind of, just a happy accident, but there's no way really that when anybody goes to Nairobi, like one of the main things that people are interested in is Matatu. And there wasn't much written about it because, as Tatiana kind of eloquently said in her kind of opening remarks, it's one of these things that's just taken for granted. And when I asked people, even though they wanted to talk about it, you know, when I told them when I went back for the Fulbright that I was going to study Matatu, they just laugh. Like, why aren't you studying something more important? But I think that, you know, anybody that has been to Nairobi knows that they're really a crucial part of what makes Nairobi Nairobi and what makes Kenya Kenya, because they were kind of emerged in the late colonial era, and they're just an important place in the city.
Thank you. That really helps. It's so nice to know the backstory of someone's way into an ethnographic study. So thank you for sharing that with all of us. One of the things that you intimated was the different, so obviously as an ethnographer, as you say, as a good ethnographer, you end up asking people about what is on their mind and what they want to talk about. I'm paraphrasing what you said. And at the same time, so you go back and you conduct years of oral histories and you have ride-alongs, you know, you try to embed yourself not just as an interviewer, but also in that life world, in the Matatu, trying to kind of gain some license to be able to actually become an apprentice at some stage, etc. Tell us a little bit about the other kinds of research methods that you had to undertake to understand the kind of layered history of Matatus and their significance, especially the kind of historical, the spatial. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So in going back, I would say that my field work was a couple different phases, right? So I did this kind of early Fulbright before I went to graduate school as an undergraduate. And this is just a note to students out there. If you want to apply for a Fulbright, we can do that, right? Like it's a lot of work, but it's possible and it's amazing. It's an amazing experience. So, you know, talk to me. If you want to do one of those, we can do that. So I did that, and then I went to grad school afterwards, and then I learned like what, you know, went through the real kind of like methodology and courses, and I was like, oh wow, I was really just like kind of winging it. But when I went back again for like my dissertation research, I had always done like, because I had been great training, I had always known we have to do, as ethnographers, we have to do some archival research. Like ethnography is a, you know, is not a, there's not like living in the ethnographic present, but it's a, you know, a period of time that has a history and has a future. So I spent a lot of time at the archives. I worked as a conductor in a Matatu just a few Sundays with I met a really close friend named Steve, who was a driver. And I said, I really want to learn, you know, I'm going to learn and document how people get trained to be a conductor. He said, yeah, that's a really good idea. I'll pick you up on Sunday and we'll like show you how we train people. So how you train people is that you pick them up on Sunday and then make them work as the conductor, which is what he did with me. And he was, you know, I'd ridden in enough Matatus, I pretty much knew what to do, but, you know, handling all the money and figuring out when people got in the vehicle, I had to, you know, calculate where they were going and how much that was going to cost and remember who they were and remember when they got off and when they got on, got off and on, had to make change, you know, all at the same time. So it was it was so much harder. So that was important and dangerous. You know, my advisors in graduate school were like, that's not what we expected. I was like, it just kind of happened. But that is a kind of, you know, participant observation that was really important. And then hanging out at the archives was fascinating. And I'll just say like one important thing that I found, and I had really great archival kind of African history training at Wash U when I was there, and I found this packet of letters that was about the colonial bus, and it was written by a bunch of European women, and they were complaining about Africans on the colonial bus. And one of the letters had this big, like, long description about a fist fight that these European women got in with African women on the bus. And they say, you know, none of the conductors and the drivers who are all African men, they didn't help us. They just like let us get beat up or whatever. And I'm reading this and and what on its face is a story of settlers, European settlers in Kenya during the late colonial era in 1956. I tried to read in between the lines as understanding what African uh, residents of Nairobi during the colonial emergency were dealing with. And I realized that the bus was a place that they could find solidarity in each other, right? Because it's like the conductors and the drivers were not trying to help these European women. They were just like letting this happen. And that they could actually like resist some of the settler colonial racial hierarchy that was in place in the city. And it was a kind of a place, the colonial bus, which then gave way to Matatu. Because like I said, there's not another system. It's not like Matatu is a dollar van that there's all these other systems and it's like a supplementary. It's the main thing. So as people live with Matatu, that's what I realized. There was a lot of like political subjectivity that was being creative in this space, which I think of as kind of like a moving urban public, because it feels like when you're in a Matatu, you're kind of writing inside of a newspaper, like a musical newspaper, if you will. So, doing participant observation by working on the Matatu, doing archival research and trying to just find, whatever I could and read it however I could, try to analyze it. A lot of people had found those letters, but no one had really read it against the grain to kind of let these African women speak through the complaints, So that was really kind of crucial to my understanding Matatu. And then, I mean, frankly, being friends with geographers and historians and working with like just people in Nairobi, like yourself, really helped me to understand, especially when you were working through the hustle stuff, right? Like I really started to understand these workers, which are just kind of called informal workers or informal transport, that like we need to look at that a little bit more. And so that really helped me develop the kind of like economic arguments that I make in the book about, solidarity and about, danger as you're negotiating your life on the street, and about how you're kind of, everybody's kind of trying to help each other in little competitive ways, right? But it brings a question to my mind, Tatiana, for you, which is, how has collaboration in the field impacted your work? Because I know you are very collaborative. So I'm just wondering if you would speak a little bit to, friendship and collaboration and how it impacts your scholarship.
So just to clarify, when you say collaboration and friendship, could it be very broadly speaking? So other fellow scholars as well as interlocutors, friends, etc.?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anything you want.
Yeah.
Go.
That's a really nice question. I think, first of all, I think one thing to say is that, and I don't want to speak for all of ethnographers and all of, ethnography as a practice, but I do think that I have tended in my own scholarship, and this is in Nairobi, but also with prison leavers in London, and as my Syrian friends in Berlin would call themselves New Berliners rather than refugees. I think I have had a tendency in my research to develop, I think friendship is a part of ethnography in my experience. So there are, of course, certain interlocutors that are individuals that you have the privilege to interview, sometimes on a one-off or very ephemeral basis, and who you may never see again.
Mhm.
And then there are other, what we might call key interlocutors who I think become more than just interlocutors. They become companions, collaborators. As you evoked with Steve, they're individuals with whom you test your analytical findings and ideas and actually collaboratively analyze some of these findings together. So as one of my key interlocutors and dear friends, Elisa, who features in a there's a whole chapter about Elisa in my book because I felt like she merited that place. So it becomes almost like a form of ethnographic portraiture that sort of assembles a series of interviews and informal conversations and homestays and cooking together and riffs together, walkabouts, etc. Elisa one day said something to the effect of, it's not often that one thinks of one's progress, or it's not often that one has the time to dwell on what your life means, or, you know, the things that surround you, etc. And so I think in that context, I have ended up, I think, forming friendships with Kenyan friends who have perhaps seen something intriguing and valuable about being invited to reflect on their own lived experience, their life worlds, and they are absolutely, you know, intellectuals. And so
Mhm.
that's why when I was saying popular intellectuals, popular experts at the start, I think that there is something so crucial about recognizing who we cite, and the citational practice in academia, I think, is becoming better about being more generous and more inventive and more creative and more lateral. But I think it has still a long way to go, you know. And so if we think about what constitutes authorship and co-authorship or co-thinking, collaboration, etc., I do think that in some ways, the kinds of conversations one can have that extend beyond the temporal unit of a half hour or an hour or even an afternoon, the conversations that get stretched over the sort of hanging out together that happens when you are friends is what then also, I think, thickens one's reading, analytical reading of what's going on. And at the same time, I think it is through that kind of formation of friendships as part of as actually integral to the method, but also, you know, I'm not saying it's instrumental, but it becomes part in some way. Ethnography, you know, you're never off, you're never out. It's not like you sort of do field work and then have a switch off button, or, you know, you're sort of always, even when you think you're just, okay, now I'm not doing field, or I'm not gathering data, I'll just go out and get dinner with, but something happens and it actually, you know, it says something that relates to what you're thinking about, writing about, etc. So it's a kind of ongoing exercise, and I do think that yeah. Anyway, so sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought. It is maybe a function of it being the time that it is, but I that's what I wanted to say, is I wanted to just acknowledge that the individuals who become, if we're lucky, you know, they are part of our life, and you and I both have lost very dear friends who've passed away through tragic circumstances, who were both key interlocutors and good friends. So it can be incredibly ephemeral and cut short, but friendship in research, I think, is both in terms of the camaraderie in our departments and our workplaces, and as well as in our field work. And I would even say, let me quote my esteemed a wonderful sociologist called Les Back, who has a wonderful book called Academic Diary, Why Higher Education Still Matters, published in 2016. And at one point he says, our students are our first and most important audience, and they are sometimes our future colleagues. And I think that's also something that's quite wonderful, is there's the kind of friendship, or let's say, the community building that happens in fieldwork and in research with key interlocutors who again become co-locutors in many ways, as well as friends. There's the kind of friendships and community building that happens amongst scholarly peers, meeting at, a random seminar in 2010 at the British Institute of East Africa. And then there is the community building that can happen in a single classroom and over the course of a semester. And I think that is, so I want to actually quote one of my heroes, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who's an abolitionist geographer, and who wrote a wonderful piece called What is to be Done in 2011. And I want to quote her because I think your question raises the connection between fieldwork teaching and our writing. And I really see those as a kind of continuum. So she writes, in the face of all of this direness, what kinds of practices of teaching, research, and analysis might we develop across disciplines towards the goal of identifying and promoting multiple routes out of crisis? And at one point in that piece, she then says, organize, organize, organize. And I guess one thing I will say, just to end on this note of friendship, etc., is that I also think it's important to allow students and other scholars to not feel the pressure of becoming good friends with their interlocutors. I've had conversations with grad students where we talk about the difficulty of, respecting boundaries and the emotional exhaustion of fieldwork, or of certain kinds of fieldwork, and so on. And I remember a grad student at the University of Zurich telling me about a year ago, I don't want to have to become friends with my interlocutors. It's not what I want. It doesn't feel like it's neither what I need as a human, nor what I feel will improve my scholarship. And it gave me pause, and it was important to hear that, because I think this is super personal, and it's sometimes it's actually harder to become friends with people in your profession, in your field work, and in the classroom. So but for me it works. It's important.
Yeah. That's a good point. Do you have a question, T?
Yeah, I have a question about just keeping an eye on the time, because I know we want to get to questions. So let me try to prioritize. Where is pardon me, I have like 5 million little bits of notes. This is an important question, I think. Why in this time of, well, first of all, in academia, heightened pressure to publish quickly, etc. In England, sometimes for promotion, writing a book counts as one article. I have a colleague I'm not going to name the university or the context, but it's dispiriting, right? So you write a book and it will count as one article for your promotion packet. And I know that in history and anthropology, it's different. I think books actually weigh much more, right? But there is a mode between generative AI and the fears that is writing a craft that merits any kind of respect anymore if generative AI can do it better than humans. I disagree, but anyway. But it is something that we need to all take seriously and consider as teachers, students, writers, etc. In that mode, and also just again the time pressures, etc. Tell me from your perspective, Meg, having just written your first book, why does ethnographic writing still matter? Why do books still matter? Why should students read long form texts as part of their learning? Why should we still invest our time and energies in writing books?
Well, that is a very good question. And I just last semester, on the last day of class, one of my students, one of my very brilliant students who's a wonderful reader, said, like, oh, Professor Ference, you just finished your first book. Does it make you sad that no one reads? And like my brother who's 13 is like, doesn't read anything longer than, 20 words. And I was like, get out. No. But it was the end of the semester. So I said, we'll pick this up next semester. And then, sobbed into my grade book. No, I think that, there is nothing like, I don't know I'll need some, neuroscience folks to like really talk to what happens in the brain when you're reading. But like you have to, reading is important for brain development of humans. But ethnography is important as a genre of book and long form article because it is immersive. And you need that time, and you need like what I really love about ethnography is the weaving together of the analytical and the conversational, the methodology with the literature, the, kind of reflection with people's funny statements about, their life where they're just like capturing a conversation like many that I have with Elizabeth in my book about, just one sentence being deeply sad and effective, and then in the next there's just this turn of phrase that's hilarious. And that the way that ethnography works is so important. And I make I have shortened my assignments, but I make students read, and I make students speaking to AI. One of the things I do, and we could talk more about AI is like, and we do as a faculty, but like doing their own ethnographic reflections is a good way to get around some of the AI stuff, because like AI doesn't do ethnographic reflections that well. So that is part of, and I think students, they've never really, like it's obvious if they try to use AI, but generally they enjoy that. They come up with some amazing stuff, and it stretches their brain because it's not a research paper. It's not, a book report. It's not a bunch of reading. It's just about like sit for a minute and watch people ordering coffee at Starbucks. Like do that for 30 minutes and then write about that.
Yeah.
And I teach a lot of methods classes, like I teach a summer school, and I teach, other kind of methods classes, and that's part of what I try to emphasize. But I will say that as someone who has like disabled people in my life, like I don't think that writing ethnography is the only way. And I'm a big fan of podcasting.
Yeah.
And I think podcasting lends itself well to ethnography because of the multivocality of it, where you can hear other voices, you can get the framing, you can get the kind of like sound design, but then you get to hear people's voices. And I really love that as like I'm trying to develop that as myself, in my own work. And also because as much as I don't, I hate the idea that like, no one should ever go to college anymore, and like our, college is being undermined all the time. I do think it's important to kind of create access to scholarly work outside of the academy. As someone who was a somewhat deviant student for a long time, the fact that like, some students may just never be able to really like go to college and not be interested. They may not be able to afford it. They may not have the time. But if they can like access ethnographic podcasts,
Yeah.
I kind of think that would be fantastic. It's like, I think we need to get anthropology. I mean, this is just an anthropological, but like anthropology in kindergarten, anthropology all the time,
Agreed.
everywhere. And I think
Yep.
we'd have a different world. But I just want to throw the question back to you, like what, as someone who just wrote, you're such an eloquent writer and speaker. What are your thoughts on, writing books? We have, I think, just to give you a time, we have like, 3 minutes or something.
Yeah. Well, I totally agree with you. I love what you said about you know, weaving these different registers of the conversational, the thick description, the analytical. I I have to say, it was obviously really hard and it took a long time, but I really enjoyed the book writing. And I felt like it gave some permission to be a bit more experimental in a way that journal articles don't necessarily. To your point about a more accessible format, and I love podcasts. I'm a big podcast junkie myself. And I love the idea of having more ethnographic podcasts. And also, I've been thinking a lot about ethnographic graphic novels. So ethnographic ethnographic novels. It's a little bit of a tongue twister. So thinking about other forms of visualization, storytelling, and so on. And I think that you're absolutely right. I don't think there's an age or an educational domain where ethnography cannot be inserted and animated. And it is, I think the thing as well about ethnography and ethnographic writing is that it is ever so capacious in terms of how it invites different forms of voicing one's reading of a situation, etc. And at the same time, one of the things I've really enjoyed in my teaching on methods, to your point, is to kind of emphasize the value of a modest claim and a modest ethnographic approach, right? Because the thing with ethnography is that you always have to be humbled by what you will ultimately not know. And therefore your assertions have to be by definition quite modest, but they can raise big questions and they can then connect and you know, bounce off of other people's work as well, etc. But they're so, it's situated and extremely kind of in some ways individualistic, but always inherently collaborative and you know, in dialogue with others, your previous, you know, not just previous scholars, but as you know, some of my colleagues often say, Victoria Okoye, who is Ghanaian British scholar who talks a lot about the importance of thinking with her ancestors when she writes, you know, about her in her fieldwork in Accra and so on. And so I think that this idea of, again, sort of thinking about ethnography, giving this permission for these more lateral and expansive forms of thinking with others in scholarly ways, but also, again, I'm super inspired, as one of the chapter talks about, by hip hop and by different forms of, you know, of different forms of narration that then inform the intellectual practice as well as the methodological one. And just to kind of say just one point on that, which connects to your previous question on style of writing and on friendship, is that for me, one of the things I was inspired by when I read Mitchell Dunier's ethnography of Sidewalk, the early 2000s, one of my favorite parts of the book was the afterword by Hakeem, who is one of Mitchell's key interlocutors and longtime friends. And what I loved about the afterword is that it wasn't a veneration of the book. It was a response from Hakeem's perspective in a way that was kind of, you know, very much acknowledging some of what we could critique about ethnography and its presumptions and its, you know, there's, I mean, so I think, because it, as we all know, ethnography kind of requires a real contending with some of its connections to colonial pasts and different forms of, like, there's an inherent power relationship, etc. So I love this idea of the afterword written by one of your key collaborators and so on. And so I asked one of my interlocutors turned friends, whose nickname is Cahors. And Cahors is, just to quickly mention, so he is, his full name is Edward Kahuthia Murimi. I keep calling him Cahors, but that's his full name. And he is finishing his PhD at Ghent University, defending next week on Thursday. And Cahors grew up in the popular neighborhood Matatu that I write about, and grew up with his 5 siblings and his single mom. And for various, you know, circumstances, went through, you know, ended up doing his PhD in Belgium, and is a human rights lawyer and a phenomenal writer and friend and person. And I asked him if he would consider writing the afterword, a sort of response to the book, which he did. And what I love and cherish about that afterword is that he definitely highlights what I might have missed and does it in a generous and humorous way. And so that, I think, is also, you know, a nice way of, again, of thinking about the fact that we write these books, but you know, they cannot do everything and they cannot see everything. So being able to find formats, whether it's podcasting or other ways, to invite that kind of response as a call and response. I think, yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Thanks, T.
Thank you both for this like lovely and thoughtful conversation, also a thought-provoking conversation. If people in the audience, I have questions, but let's open it up. If people in the audience have questions, you can put your hand up, you can put it in the chat, and I'll read it. But yes, I invite you all to sort of ask questions or make comments on this lovely conversation that we've been having about so many different things, all interconnected, but so many different things. Maybe I'll jump in while people type up their questions in the chat, because we got to hear Meghan's backstory to the book, and it's quite amazing, going all the way back to your undergrad. But Tatiana, we didn't get to hear your backstory. So what brought you to this very specific? What specifically brought you to this project and kept you at the project?
Okay, I'm going to try to keep it as short and as soon as I see a question pop up, to like start to wrap it up. I admire, Meg, how nicely you kind of narrated that backstory in such a cohesive, coherent way, because I feel like suddenly I was thinking, oh my goodness, where would I start? Long story short, in 2005, I had finished my master's in law and anthropology. So my first degree was in anthropology and dance, and my second in law and anthropology. I was studying trafficking of women, which was a very difficult topic for various reasons. And I ended up deciding not to go down the kind of law school route and researching that further or doing work in that further, because I felt like there was no real way to well, I have to say, I think another thing that animates my work is like a persistent, stubborn search for hopeful imaginaries or hopeful ethnographies in some form, even if they are in these very precarious contexts. So trafficking of women was one that I felt not equipped to kind of keep going and, down that route. One afternoon, my partner was doing his master's back at Cornell University, which is where we both met as undergrads. And to support him, he was kind of co-organizing a symposium. This was in a business school. So he was interested in sustainable business and sustainable development, and was co-organizing a symposium on how to engage in commercially engage lower income communities, entrepreneurs, producers, etc., and to think about how the role of business could insert itself in some of the sustainable development goals and so on. At the time, I thought that the proposition was both refreshingly optimistic, but very naive, because a lot of the language in the business school and the business scholarship at the time was actually borrowing from anthropology and, development studies folks who were doing participatory research and so on, and thinking about appreciative inquiry and rapid ethnographic appraisal, and sort of really trying to, people who are trying to expand not just their vocabulary, but their own scholarships, etc. It turns out that at the end of that symposium, I was both annoyed, but also thought, we need anthropologists in this space. Like, we need ethnographers to insert their voice and themselves and actually roll up their sleeves and just, be involved in whatever this is turning out to be. Because it was a scholarship that was trying to very much present itself as business-led development or business approaches to poverty alleviation, etc. So things that could be heavily critiqued from a certain more left-wing social science perspective, but I thought it would be interesting to at least be listening and try to be a bit open-minded to what was going on, or at least study it, even as an ethnography of that. So then, long story short, in 2005, I ended up being able to go to Kenya on a project. I see a question there, Ria, so I'm going to stop soon. But I went to Kenya in 2005 on a project where there were other master students from engineering and the business school. And I was the only person with an anthropology background. And this was about trying to create a particular methodology for perhaps supporting businesses that were currently working in more mainstream economies and wanted to be able to commercially engage with, collaborate with, build businesses with entrepreneurs in these more underserved markets. That was my first time in Kenya. And I'll stop there because then I went back to do my PhD in 2009, trying to think that, oh, I'm going to do an ethnography of these corporate community partnerships. And most of the people that I ended up meeting and have been in touch with since were involved in the informal waste labor and waste economy in Nairobi, in these underserved neighborhoods. And they were also very savvy at connecting with the social enterprises and development actors that wanted to partner with low-income communities. And so that's where everything started. And from there, you know, it went way beyond that.
Fantastic. Thanks for giving it. It's always useful to get that backstory. We got 3 questions actually, and 2 of them are from your colleagues, Meghan, and shout out to the colleagues in anthropology for showing up. It's lovely to see that kind of community. Question, I know, right? I was like, look at that. So the first question in the chat says, I love what you share about Matatu as a moving newspaper. Can you say more about what that means? And let's keep the answers a little short because we want to make sure to get to Pat and Alan.
Sure. So thank you, Ria, for that question. That is something I came up with like literally the last day I was writing my book. But it took me only 20 years to figure out that, that made sense. And really it's because when you get into a Matatu, there is so much messaging. So there's slogans, there's stickers, there's music, there's talk radio, there's discussions, there's debates, there's also you reading the newspaper, people reading your newspaper over your shoulder, reading your phone over your shoulder. There's so much, kind of discussion, and like it's like the op-ed pages come to life. So it's like if you think of a newspaper as, like we've got the news of the day, we've got politics, we've got media, we've got sports, it's all there. And in this way of kind of thinking about what makes a public, like this idea of like a reading public, it's like a writing public. And there's so much exchange. And with the talk radio, which is really, really important in Kenya, there's a lot of talk radio where they're arguing and then people call in and argue. That is a big kind of form of entertainment. So that's part of why I tried to kind of translate what it feels like to be in a matatu, which is just like you have messages flying all over the place. So that's what I meant by that.
Fantastic. Got 3 questions. So let me go straight to Pat.
Hi, I just want to thank you both. This is a really engaging, fun interaction and learning a lot about Matatus and Nairobi. But my question is about women and labor and your looking at environmental issues. And if you could just say a bit about something you've discussed about women moving toward electric vehicles and how that might possibly happen and how that will affect the environment in Nairobi.
Oh, wow, Pat.
Sorry.
Deep cut, Pat. Nice question. I'll just say that when I had been in Nairobi for a long time studying Matatus, and like I said, it's very male-dominated space. We didn't spend too much time talking about it, but in 2012, there was a regulation that allowed far more women to start working in the sector. And so those around 2012, now there's about 10% of the working workforce is women, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's really a lot. And like there's women kind of everywhere. And then a couple years ago when I went to Kenya, I met with a guy who was fabricating and importing electric vehicles to put into the Matatu sector. So not to compete with the Matatu, but to like make electric Matatu. And because of the way that the Matatu and this like what I just described, this like loud, crazy space of the Matatu is perceived as a very masculine space, these electric vehicles strangely are, I don't know if it's strange, but they're perceived as a kind of a feminine space. They're quiet, they're kind of brand new. There's usually cashless payments, so people don't have to like haggle. There's not loud music. And so what I found in the past couple years is that women have found almost every electric vehicle I've ridden on, women have been conducting. They've been working in it. So for whatever reason, women seem to be able to access this niche, like EV space. And then I feel like, I don't know, but you know, my hope and our hope with my colleagues and my, you know, interlocutors in Kenya, you know, our hope is that there's more EVs and that women essentially become the dominant EV drivers. And it will never be probably like all EVs, and men don't really want women to be on these big manyangas. Like they'll say things like, oh, women don't know how to yell, which is like, have you ever met a woman that can't yell? But it's weird that the stereotype of femininity is kind of working towards women being really key players for this EV transition. So it's still early days, but it could be a very interesting situation. So thank you for that question, Pat.
Thank
Great
you.
question.
May,
I
may
told
I,
you.
s-
Yeah.
may I say a quick thing just to give a quick shout out to a wonderful Kenyan scholar, Wangui Kimari, who writes a lot about what she calls the socio-ecological struggles in the same neighborhood where I work in Mathadi. She's been working for a very long time as a scholar and activist with a social justice center there. And a lot of her writing focuses on the women and the role that women play in really trying to address these socio-ecological struggles of neighborhoods that have been persistently forgotten and, you know, sort of ignored in terms of not able to access mainstream services. And at the same time, I've ended up focusing a lot on youth, but there is a lot of solidarity between sort of intergenerational solidarity between women, older women, and youth who are underemployed and therefore trying to find all of these different modes of income generation where they think about the environment as this kind of like very plural space. So from waste collection to urban farming to recycling and repair. At the moment, there's a lot of work on river restoration after very heavy floods last year. So the role of women in the kind of, as you know, Meghan evoked Wangari Maathai, the role of the kind of women ecological activism is incredibly powerful across different spheres in Nairobi and the rest of Kenya.
For sure.
So I told you it was a thought-provoking conversation because we still have 3 questions. And so we'll just keep moving along. Alan, why don't you jump in?
Okay. First of all, thank you, Tatiana, for referring me to this. I'm also from her department at UCL, so very grateful to be a guest at this wonderful virtual event. I'll try and be quick. I've got kind of a comment and a question. So personally, I'm really interested in delving deep into informal transport practices, particularly the social embeddedness of the marshrutka mobility phenomenon, which echoes what Meghan was researching about the matatus in many ways, particularly the aspects of mutuality, reciprocity, and kinship in transport work and everyday life. So first of all, I find your work, Meghan, and experiences of Matatus in Nairobi as super inspiring and genuinely an amazing, fascinating study. So again, I'm grateful to Tatiana for referring me to this, and it was certainly worth staying up for on a school night. Anyway, my question is to uncover your thoughts to really determine the importance of informal transport practices such as negotiation, bartering, makeshift operations, etc., against the grain of formalization, institutionalization, and more general mainstream regulation of matatus. Of course, I'm not super in the loop of matatus, so I expect some fact checking on one side, as well as really gathering your personal perspectives and opinion on the matter. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Wow, staying up late. That's amazing. I will just quickly, Tatiana should put us in touch and we'll have a longer conversation. But I will just kind of bring an example from the book, and it might even speak to Elizabeth's question in the chat, which is that there was a really key part of what I noticed when I started to get into Matatu, which is that, you know, everybody hated the fact that when they get into Matatu, that sometimes what will happen is that you'll be going along and then the Matatu will stop. Your driver that's been driving you will jump out. The conductor that's been taking your money will get into the driver's seat, and then some other person will jump in and start collecting money. And it's like, what is happening here? And why is there a child driving the vehicle? And people really hate that, you know, and they think that that's like putting them at risk, whatever. What I found, and, you know, I noticed, you know, essentially what it is that each Matatu runs on a loop, right, from town to the neighborhood, and they call it a squad. And each of these squads is worth essentially like about 100 shillings, 100 to 200 shillings, sometimes more. But what was happening was not only on the job training, where it's like, when are you going to learn how to drive a Matatu unless you get in to the driver's seat and drive it a little bit? When are you going to learn how to be a conductor unless you're just made to be a conductor? And then the other was that, you know, people would take this cash, and although this is one of the big stigmatized practices, because they say that it's not, you know, what you are putting our lives at risk. But what's also happening for the workers is that they're able to go to town, get a squad, and get dinner, get lunch, you know, get one meal, or just get something. And it's all this like reciprocal cash economy. And a lot of people really want people to make salaries, right? This is like the way that of a developed, formalized, informal sector would look, is like, we need to have salaries and like people just get their, you know, weekly paycheck. But it would undo a lot of these hustlers, right? This is part of how people, you know, one of my interviewees, Jackson, he said, you know, each Matatu employs 100 people. And what he meant is like, it's like employs all these different people, mechanics, musicians, DJs, and all of these people are just taking squads. So, you know, that is just one example to kind of speak to your question. And it's why it's really hard to regulate these vehicles, because people they even if they say like, yeah, definitely, like, give us a salary, they also want to take a break and they want somebody else to drive for a minute. So they want to, you know, have that flexibility, like truly flexible labor and a work-life balance that we definitely don't recognize that much in the US in the same way. So that's just kind of, you know, just to speak to Alan, your wonderful question, and to Elizabeth on the chat, which is like, the hustle is part of this like informal, you know, life, or this kind of like creative reciprocal life, and everybody's contributing. Doesn't mean there aren't arguments, doesn't mean there's not competition. It's just the nature of the structure of the business. So I hope that helped a little bit.
Yeah, really fascinating answer. Thank you very much. Definitely helps a lot. If I find some similar findings in my research, I will be thrilled.
Yes.
It seems like we're
Thank you
building.
very much.
Seems like we're building a, you know, international community here, right? With Meghan and Alan. So fantastic. I have a question. In the chat, it says, do you have any good visual reference books on Matatu? Maybe something for a more visual or design approach. I dig this, so I want to learn more.
So so I have now, I'm not really on Instagram, but Instagram has a ton of like Matatu accounts, but there is not, and Tatiana, tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's like, there should be like an art book on Matatus, but it's generally online. There's a bunch of archives of Matatu art. My book has a number of pictures in it, which is, you know, not necessarily that common in academic books, but it's got like 25 pictures. And just to say that, like, one of the pictures, or a couple of the pictures, feature the world famous cellist Yo-Yo Ma, who really loves Matatus and was like playing his cello inside of a Matatu. And that, you know, so there's some really beautiful visual, you're right, it's a very visual thing, but there is not to date, I think, like any kind of book just focusing on that. So maybe that is something, Lloyd, that, you know, you can get started on in your next trip to Kenya Or maybe, you know, Tatiana and I can do that as a side project, as a side hustle.
I think we're all going to go.
Oh.
It's a great question because I found your descriptions, you know, kind of drawing the picture of it, right? But the curiosity just makes me want to, like, you know, appreciate the design and the kind of the taking of, like, making, designing the space. So and then Elizabeth's question, I think you addressed it somewhere. Is there any final comments in sort of in light of what Elizabeth is asking?
So yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, that essentially it's kind of interesting that you're kind of like, is it good or bad? And I will just say that that is part of, it's a controversial and ambivalent aspect, as both of Tatiana and I, that's why we've always gotten along, and like our research is very adjacent, because, you know, she works with hustlers, but like waste workers, right? So people who are, you know, her earlier like cleaning toilets and recycling and collecting garbage. And then people, I'm working with these Matatu operators, which people literally hate and want to kill, and you know, throw in jail and dislike and stigmatize. So, you know, it's bad. They're seen as bad. But as we both, you know, as you get deeper into knowing these folks and working with them, you realize that this is not, you know, it's not about really like the good or the bad, but it is the what is. You know, it's the survival, it's the making life, you know, work, and you know, and being creative. It's very, very creative, and a lot of like energy goes into it. So, but that is a really interesting, you know, it's a framing that people have really strong feelings for and against these groups of people, and it's something that's part of what our research is trying to do, is like you know, fill out some of the, like, undo some of the damage that people have in their just stereotypical idea of who these people are. And a lot of people have these ideas having never met or ridden a Matatu. And yet they're the ones that are kind of making rules and laws that govern them, you know? So, and T, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's Elizabeth's question points to something really interesting that I think we've tried to grapple with for so many years, as you're suggesting, Meg, which is this kind of, how do we think about the ambiguous moral registers that Matatu work and, you know, young people in popular neighborhoods who work in various kinds of circular economies, waste work, but also are eco activists and hip hop artists, and, you know, the way that things get done are sometimes they subvert certain norms. And so I think one of the things that we both try to perhaps do in different ways in very different contexts is think about what, you know, what are the narratives and the logics and the urban practices of individuals who are systematically either criminalized or marginalized, or whose stories are and narratives are misrepresented, or whose work gets relabeled by more mainstream discourses as a form of gigging or entrepreneurship or informality. And sometimes the kinds of economies that we're talking about and the different practices we're talking about could be perceived as a form of gig work or informal work or entrepreneurship, but I think we're also trying to suggest that it is more than that as well, and that those terms are often defining practices by negation, by what they are not, or almost lamenting what they are no longer, in the case of, if we think about precarity as a concept of erosion of a wage, etc. And so how do we better understand these economics and cultural and political spheres that, you know, that sort of say more than just a kind of economic centric story? But and it's not necessarily, and here I want to actually go back to your idea, Elizabeth, of saying, is it either good or bad? Because you know, James Ferguson, who very recently passed away, sadly, had this wonderful quote about, it's something to the effect of, it's not about whether or not development is good or bad. It's about understanding its effects, right? In his seminal work on the anti-politics machine, and trying to understand the effects of the regime of development. We could think about different regimes. regimes of labor and it's changing forms of labor, etc. So I think if we reframe the question a tiny bit to think about, it's not even, maybe it doesn't help us that much to think about whether it's good or bad, because ultimately the workers, whether they are in the Matatu sector or waste workers in Nairobi, who also have multiple other sources of income and learning and community work, some of which is remunerated, others which is not, they ultimately are very savvy about identifying an opportunity space.
Mhm.
And that can sometimes be an ad hoc form of employment. And sometimes it can be something that might be perceived as an illicit economy, but that's what's available in that moment. And it has a logic and a rationale and a skill, you know. So then to ask someone, and this is the work that I've done in London with prison leavers, is not to ask them what job they had or what was legal or illegal, what got them into prison, but it's what are you good at? And so it shifts a little bit, like the idea of how we might normatively classify, because as researchers or as individuals, we always carry some bias. We might say, oh, that doesn't, you know, that kind of, some things might disrupt our own perceived moral compass, but actually if we can maybe detangle ourselves, or at least acknowledge that, wait, let's suspend those classifications and just try to understand how people narrate what they're doing and analyze it, describe it, then maybe we can, yeah, I guess that's what we're still trying to figure out, you and I.
And
Beautiful
us
said.
along with you. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Let me say a recording of this event will be available in the Wolves Institute YouTube channel. I also want to say thank you, Meghan. Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you for these awesome books. They are smart. They are important to people like, you know, us who live in urban areas, including New York. They are beautifully written, and yet they're hopeful. You know, as Tatiana mentioned earlier. Thank you for sharing your research, your insights, your smarts, inviting us to learn with you tonight. And I want to thank all of you who joined us, students, colleagues, community members. And I want to invite you again to please join. We have 3 more new book events coming up in April. The link is in the chat. And I want to invite you to join us April 1st through the 4th for Hess Week with Melissa Murray at Brooklyn College, including a panel on podcasting with some rock star podcasters. So hope to see you during Hess Week, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, everyone, for being part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaston.
Lost in translation, could have sworn that you were good when you said that you were good, you were lying. Sahi will go, I can't get through. Lord knows I'm trying, but I can't get through. I can't get through to you.